Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining you today, and thank you for the kind words. Let me share my screen so that you see my slides. So you have kindly introduced my co-authors, and this is a paper with Brexit referendum in the title. And at the most basic level, it is a paper about how Brexit referendum affected labor markets in the United Kingdom. But it's not just a Brexit paper. It is also a paper showing that anticipated yet not realized barriers to exports matter. It's also a paper about services, showing that barriers to services exports matter. And it's also a paper demonstrating that sometimes the interesting implication of a policy shock is something that's not visible, something that could have happened, should have happened, but has not happened. And in this case, these are jobs that would have been advertised online in the absence of the outcome of the particular outcome of the Brexit referendum. Now, so I am not going to assume a lot of prior knowledge about Brexit. So let me give you a very quick introduction to this. So the UK has been part of the European community and then the European Union for decades. And as the time was progressing, the EU was undergoing more and tighter integration. And the basic assumption of the basic cornerstone of the single market was the so-called four freedoms: freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people. So what the Brexit referendum did is it introduced the prospect of unraveling, of undoing decades of deep integration of goods, of services markets, though not complete, free movement of labor, regulatory convergence, and so on and so forth. And given our interest in services, it's important to mention that it created threats of substantial complex barriers to trade in services being introduced. So if you are sitting in Turkey and you're not particularly interested in Brexit per se, you can think of this paper as documenting the labor market consequences of deep integration going into reverse. So it's a paper about how prospects of barriers to exports, so anticipated and not yet realized barriers, may matter for real outcomes. So in particular, we ask the following question: what were the implications of the threat of future barriers UK would be facing in its export markets on online job postings? And we are fortunate to have access to the data on near universe of UK job postings for the period 2015 and 2019. Job postings are an attractive measure because they are probably as close as we get in academic research to capturing labor demand. And because you can get data on job postings at high granularity, meaning this is high frequency data, and it allows you to observe how firms, in this case, react to changing circumstances. In this paper, we take the perspective of local labor markets. And so looking from a perspective of an individual labor market, we ask how much this particular locality is or was likely to be affected by future barriers to exports, and in particular to services exports. Now, I keep on focusing on services in my introduction because services are the star of the paper, even though in the paper we also take into account barriers to future trade in goods. We take into account exchange rate depreciation and immigration policy. Now, just to give you a bit of a context, you may wonder why it is services that play such a big role in this paper and in this episode. And that's for two reasons, because UK is a very services-oriented economy. Services account for a very large chunk of GDP. And second, it is because relatively early on, in the month preceding the referendum and after the referendum took place, there was actually little appetite or little discussion about protectionist measures in goods. So in other words, the public discourse was such that with the exception of, of very conservative groupings talking about hard Brexit, actually majority of commentators and observers were anticipating relatively low barriers to trade in goods in the aftermath of Brexit. By the way, please feel free to ask questions. I believe you can raise your hand or just type your question in the chat, and my fellow panelists will read them to them. So for the remaining 40 minutes or so, I will try to convince you that UK localities which were more exposed to future barriers to exports of professional services reduced hiring after the Brexit referendum, right? And that's relative to areas which were less exposed to those barriers. And this decline in hiring was concentrated in good jobs, professional jobs, high-skilled jobs. And then I am going to zoom in on the post-referendum period, and I will try to convince you that this decline was responding to changes in uncertainty associated with future trade policy. So that's where we are going. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on related literature. Let me just say that we contribute to the literature on services by showing that services barriers matter. We contribute to the literature on labor market effects of trade integration. We focus on disintegration rather than integration, and we focus on an outcome that has not been studied before in the trade literature, namely online job postings. And finally, we contribute to this new but fast growing literature on job postings, which hasn't yet ventured into the international trade territory. Now, as I mentioned, I am not assuming much knowledge of Brexit, so let me give you a big, a quick summary of the Brexit timeline. I think it's fair to say that the United Kingdom was probably the least enthusiastic member of the European Union. British public was sold on joining the European community as joining a free trade area in goods. The British public was told that initially that European community was all about free trade in goods. But as decades were passing by, closer and closer integration took place, free movement of labor was introduced, liberalization of services took place, and part of the British public were increasingly uncomfortable with that integration. And particularly there was a big surge in migration, in migrant inflows, and there was a debate about the desirability of migrants coming into the country. So in response to those debates, in 2013, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, declared he was in favor of conducting a referendum on whether or not the UK should stay in the European Union. This referendum indeed took place 3 years later. And actually, nobody seriously anticipated the possibility of Brexit. And there are several indications of that. For instance, members of the cabinet of the Prime Minister were allowed to campaign for Brexit, to be part of the Leave campaign. On the morning post-referendum or the night of the referendum, when the surprising outcome was revealed, the pound sterling depreciated very strongly and actually has not fully recovered since then. And this large depreciation is a sign that the outcome of the referendum was unanticipated. Now, because Brexit as an outcome of the referendum was not anticipated, there was very little done in terms of preparation for the post-Brexit future. Nobody really had a very detailed plan. So it took until end of March 2017 for the government of Theresa May to formally notify the EU that Britain was intending to leave. And it wasn't until July 2018 that the UK government spelled out its vision for the post-Brexit future in a white paper. In November of the same year, the withdrawal agreement was agreed and published. This withdrawal agreement was voted down 3 times in the parliament in the UK. Theresa May stepped down and was replaced by Boris Johnson, who promised to get Brexit done. And indeed, the UK left the European Union at the end of January 2020, with a year-long transition period. And this transition period the transition period finished at the beginning of 2021, but pretty much until the last minute, until Christmas Eve of the preceding year, there was no Brexit deal. And one can argue that the details of the post-Brexit future have not been finalized yet. Now, in the slide, you see 3 dates being in bold, because these 3 dates are going to play a role in our analysis. And by the end of my talk, I will try to convince you that online job postings reacted to 3 events you see here. So as I mentioned, we take the perspective of local labor markets, which in the UK are called travel to work areas. There are 218 of them. If you exclude Northern Ireland, which we do because Northern Ireland was subject to additional issues when it came to negotiating post-Brexit future. So just to keep things simple, we exclude it. The definition of a travel to work area is essentially that 3/4 of the workforce work in the area, so 3/4 of residents work in the area, and at least 3/4 of people who work there also live there. And these travel to work areas differ very much in size. They differ from almost 7,000 to 8 million. If you look at the map here, Oxford is a travel to work area. In the middle, you see the city of Oxford, 150,000 inhabitants, and then smaller towns around Oxford belong to this travel to work area. Now let me say a few words about our outcome of interest, namely job postings data. These job postings are collected by a company called Burning Glass Technologies. This company scrapes about 40,000 online job boards and company websites on daily basis. So according to them, they collect almost the universe of online job postings in the UK on daily basis. Now, they remove duplicates. So basically in the data, what we observe is the first date when an online job is being advertised. If the same job appears on multiple websites, it's counted only once. If it appears for a longer time period, it's only counted on the first day when it appeared. So there is no double or triple counting. For the period of 5 years that we consider, we observe almost 30 million job postings in the UK. And Burning Glass Technologies classify these jobs by travel to work area, which is a standard classification in the country. Now, the question that typically comes up is how good is the data in terms of coverage? Now, actually, there is no census of job postings in general. The best information that is available comes from UK vacancy survey, which is a survey. And if we compare what we have to what the UK vacancy survey reports, on average, we cover 86% of total vacancies that are reported in that survey. Now, because we take the perspective of local labor markets, we want to understand the employment structure of those local labor markets. Such information can be obtained from Business Register and Employment Survey, which gives us information on by travel to work area and detailed industry code. And we have this information on employment by, so it gives us employment by location and by detailed sector. And essentially this Business Register and Employment Survey covers more than 90% of total UK labor force. So that's the best source of data one can have. Now, as I mentioned, our paper is about services. So what we would like to do, or what we need to do, is to quantify how the Brexit referendum, this unexpected outcome of the decision by the UK to leave the European Union, how it was going to affect barriers to services trade for UK firms selling services to the European Union. Now, I'm going to talk about the European Union, but technically the relevant area is the European Economic Area, which includes countries such as, for instance, Iceland and Norway. So luckily for us, OECD has been producing an index of services trade restrictiveness. And this index is produced at country industry level. So for each country within the European Economic Area and for major services industries, OECD rates the extent of restrictions to foreign supply of services. And they do it in two ways. They capture restrictions EU countries imposed against other countries within the single market, as well as restrictions that EU countries impose on non-EU countries. So there are two versions of this index, which allow us to have a proxy for how, in the aftermath of the referendum, people could form expectations about, what trade regime would prevail after the UK leaves a single market. And what is the main trade service? So UK financial services are one of the most important services sectors that are being traded, but there are many others, from insurance, from legal services, to accounting and architecture. So there is quite a range of services being exported by the UK to the European Union. Now, this OECD Trade Services Index covers restrictions, various types of restrictions. So for instance, restrictions of entry of foreign firms, restrictions on entry of foreign professionals who could be providing services, barriers to competition. So examples of restrictions include things like maximum equity share a foreign firm can hold in local business, restrictions on cross-border measures, regulations pertaining to services products. So what we do in our analysis is we look at the gap in how restricted imports of services are from within the single market, so from the European Economic Area, versus how restricted are imports from third countries, from non-members, right? And that gives us a proxy for how, for the increase in barriers UK could have reasonably expected to see. We focus on the following services: finance, insurance, legal, accounting, ICT, telecom, engineering, and architecture. So now, how do we construct our measure that we will use in the analysis? Now note that this index, Services Restrictiveness Index, is specific to a country and sectors. Various EU countries have various types of restrictions. These restrictions are not uniform. So we have variation at the country industry level. So that means that we take a difference. So we look at the expected increase in restrictions to services export, and we take the average across all EU countries, so obviously excluding the UK. And this is a weighted average where we take into account how important each of these countries was for the UK as an export destination in that sector, right? So this is average increase in barriers UK exporters in sector J, services sector J, can expect. Now, we also want to take into account how tradable that services sector was. So we multiply this expected increase in restrictions by UK exports per worker employed in that industry. So these are average exports of that type of service per employee and in that sector. Note that we construct this measure for the pre-referendum period. The referendum took place in June 2016. We use measures for 2015 or 2014. Here it is, the index is not available for 2015. That's why we use 2014. Now, so what that gives us is exposure of each services industry to increase in export barriers. Now we want to bring this exposure to the level of locality, our travel to work area. So what we do is we look at the employment structure of each travel to work area, and we create a weighted average of exposure of various services sector where the weights are employment shares. So as a locality, your exposure to barriers is higher if many people are employed, if large share of your population or of your workforce is employed in services, and in particular in services that are likely to face a larger increase in barriers. How big are these increases? So here you see the raw index scores from OECD. The top line is restrictiveness vis-a-vis WTO members. So these are countries which are not part of the European Economic Area. The second, this bright blue line captures the restrictiveness vis-a-vis other members of the European Economic Area, and the STRI gap is the third line. So here you see some examples of country sector pairs where anticipated increase was the largest. So that's, for instance, legal services in Poland. If you want to provide legal services in Poland and you are not part of the European Economic Area, you need to take an exam. And I guess I don't have to explain you that an exam in Polish is not the easiest thing to do. But it's not just legal services. In Slovakia, engineering sector is quite restrictive to foreign providers. Architecture, you see legal services being there featured prominently, but then in Iceland, it's the computer industry, and in Norway, it's the accounting industry that's highly protected, right? So why am I showing you this? First, to show that the increase in restrictions was non-negligible. the index has the value from 0 to 1. And you see that in some sectors, the increase was at the order of 0.6. So quite significant. And second, I want to show you that there is actually a lot of variation across countries and services. Now, when we bring this anticipated increase in export barriers in services to the level of local labor markets, you see that there's a lot of variation across the United Kingdom. Many people may be tempted to think that it is just London, but actually it's not. Edinburgh is the place with the highest exposure to services barriers, followed by Halifax, and which is a home to a building society and financial institutions. So you see a lot of localities. London is only in the 6th place, and a lot of geographic variation. Now, let me talk a bit about trade in goods. In our analysis, we consider the worst case scenario, which is the scenario of the so-called hard Brexit, meaning that trade with the European Union would revert to the WTO terms. That would mean that UK firms would be subject to MFN tariffs. Now, these tariffs actually are not that huge. If you look at the 6-digit product level, European Union MFN tariffs exceed 15 percentage points only in 2% of products. And, you know, only 37% of products have a tariff above 5%. So yes, had hard Brexit happened and had trade reverted to the WTO terms, it would have mattered, but it wouldn't. The increase in tariffs wouldn't be huge if you look at these statistics. So what we do with tariffs is we use the same logic as with barriers to services. Basically, for each industry, manufacturing industry J, we calculate the average MFN tariff, right? So this is the situation where you go from free trade, 0 tariff, to facing suddenly MFN tariff. And this is the average tariff for products which are relevant to that industry and which are weighted by how important each of these products is in UK exports to the EU. And then we take into account tradability of each manufacturing sector by, again, taking into account exports per employee in that industry. So this gives us tariff exposure at the level of each manufacturing sector, and then we bring it to the level of travel to work area by calculating a weighted average over all manufacturing sector where the weights are relevant employment shares. So employment shares in that sector, in that travel to work area. And if you look at the map, you see again, there's a lot of variation across travel to work areas. And you see that these are different areas that were exposed to the threats of barriers of tariffs than areas that were exposed to threats of barriers in services. Now, so our baseline specification, you can think of this is as a diff in diff, right? Where you have, in a sense, a shock that happens and continuous treatment. So what we focus on is we look at the number of job postings. So total number of job postings in a given travel to work area in period T, where period T is a month, is a calendar month in a particular year. We take a log of job posting. And then we ask how these job postings were reacting after the referendum, depending on how exposed each locality was to future barriers to trade. So this trade barrier exposure it can be either exposure to services barriers or exposure to tariffs. And then note that we don't need to have trade barrier exposure by itself because we have locality fixed effects, and we don't need the post-vote dummy by itself because we have period fixed effects. Then we also include a series of locality time periods specific controls, which I will discuss in a second. And we do two-way clustering by time period T and locality. Now, Brexit vote, or Brexit itself, was not only about trading goods and trading services. One of the market reactions that I mentioned was the large overnight depreciation of the sterling with respect to the dollar and the euro right after the referendum. So obviously, strength of the currency affects trade. So we want to take it into account by essentially looking at real effective exchange rate as calculated by the IMF, and basically assuming that this change in exchange rate matters more if employment in a given locality is geared towards sectors with high exports. And these are exports per employee in a given industry. So you can think of this as exposure of a given locality to exchange rate movement given its export structure. The final channel through which that we consider in this paper is immigration policy. As I have already signaled, discourse about immigration and the desire to limit free movement of labor was a big driver of the Brexit debate. And it became pretty clear after the referendum that the government intended to stop free movement of labor. So what we take into account is exposure of each locality to migrant labor from the European Union. So again, for each industry, we know employment share by, for each locality, we know the employment share by sector, and then we know broadly where EU migrants tend to work, in which sectors. Now, we have a little bit more information as sectors where they work. We also have this information by broadly defined regions, but these are very coarse regions. So essentially, what we create here is a proxy for exposure of the locality or dependence of the locality on migrant workers. Now, we take into account either all EU nationals or nationals from the new EU member states, so Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Baltic states, and so on. So finally, some basic results. Remember, we have locality fixed effects, we have time period fixed effects. These are monthly data on job postings in each locality. What we find is that after the Brexit vote, localities with greater exposure to services barriers in the export market saw a decline in the number of online job postings. Note that this effect is robust to controlling for exposure to tariffs, exchange rate movement, and dependence on migrant labor force. Now, what's the story here? Well, you can think of the story as under normal circumstances, a country grows, you would expect firms to grow and increase their employment. So the prospects of barriers in export markets put a brake on firms' expansion, and that's why firms are not advertising jobs. Or you can think of a story where there is some natural churning, people retire, people switch jobs, and they are not being replaced. So this is the story you can have in your mind as you look at these results. Now, how big are these effects? Well, they are quite sizable. 1 standard deviation increase in exposure of a given locality to services barriers in export markets reduces postings by about 5%, right? So on average, the average number of monthly postings in a travel to work area is almost 2,500. So that's a decline of 120 postings per month per locality. Now, the question that typically comes up at this time of this presentation is, how big is the aggregate effect, right? So we do some very much back of the envelope calculation, and we say, well, look, now assume that the threat of those barriers in export markets did not exist, meaning all localities were exposed to those barriers as little as travel to work area at the 10th percentile of the exposure score. And under this counterfactual scenario, we would have seen 1.5 million more postings over the full period. Just to put this 1.5 million into perspective, the UK labor force is on the order of 30 million. So this is actually a substantial number. Now, what we do is we try to unpack these effects by looking at the timing. So we do it for 2 reasons. First, we are worried about pre-trends. So we want to show you that there are no pre-trends. And second, we do it because we find this exercise interesting in its own right. So what we do is now we focus on service exposure to services barriers, but we allow for a different coefficient quarter by quarter, right? And we control for these other type of shocks, so exchange rates, exposure to tariffs, and so on. So, and the omitted category are the first 2 periods. So this would be quarters 1 and 2 of 2015. The red line, this is the quarter when the referendum happens. So first, there is no evidence of pre-trends, meaning there's no evidence that localities that as a result of the Brexit referendum were highly exposed to services barriers had different trends in online advertising prior to Brexit vote. Brexit vote happens, and then as you see, there is very little reaction. And that's linked, I think, to this big uncertainty, to the fact that nobody had a plan of what to do in the post-Brexit future, that actually prior to the referendum, there had been no real national debate of what the post-Brexit Britain would look like. So the first reaction of job postings you see is in the second quarter of 2017. So this is right after Theresa May's government invoked Article 50, meaning they formally notified the European Union of their intention to leave. And that's where you see a reaction of job postings. Job postings go down in localities with high exposure to services barriers. Then the next dip happens here in this third quarter, so third quarter of 2018. And that coincides with the publication of the white paper, where for the first time the UK government spelled out its intentions, its negotiating intentions, its vision for the post-Brexit future. And essentially it said is our intention is to leave the single market, which means that for instance, in financial services, we will be relying on something called mutual recognition, meaning the hope is that the UK and that the EU will consider its regulation in services industries as equivalent, and therefore international trade in services will continue. Now note that this mutual recognition is a big step down relative to the EU membership in the single market, because this mutual recognition can be invoked at any point in time, and because the stated purpose of Brexit was to become independent, was sovereignty, not to be forced to follow EU regulation. Just to give you a bit more on this Brexit white paper, this is an excerpt from the Financial Times, where the City of London Corporation called this strategy outlined in this white paper a real blow for the UK's financial and related professional services sectors. And that's essentially because the white paper confirmed that Britain would want to have a free trade for goods, but a looser relationship on services, right? And remember, these are the services industries represent 80% of the UK economy. And basically, Britain would seek its freedom to chart its own path, meaning regulatory divergence. So that was a big blow for services, and no surprise that there was a reaction. Now, I'm mindful of the time, so let me speed up here. Then thanks to our data, we are able to consider high-skilled and low-skilled occupation. There is a standard classification in the UK into 4 categories. Here, we do something very basic. Top 2 categories we consider as high skill, bottom 2 as low skill. And essentially, if you repeat the exercise, but now you change the left-hand side variable to either being only high-skill job postings or low-skill job postings, what you see is significant negative effect of barriers to services exports, which translates into many more job postings, many fewer job postings in localities exposed to those barriers after the referendum. But the interesting part here is that the coefficient is larger for highly skilled job postings than for low skilled job postings, meaning it is high skilled job postings that are not being advertised, high skilled jobs that are not being advertised. So before the effect was almost 5%, now it's almost 6%. Now, what we do is we can also disaggregate the data by occupation. So we can do separate analysis, occupation by occupation. And where you see the effect are the good jobs. We see that as a result of those anticipated barriers to services exports, many fewer vacancies for managers, directors, and senior officials are being advertised, fewer vacancies for professional occupations, for associate, professional, and technical occupations. So these are good jobs. What's also interesting here is that suddenly we see tariff exposure coming to life. We see that localities which have high exposure to tariffs on goods exports see fewer jobs advertised for process, plant, and machine operatives. Essentially, these are production workers, people who produce things in manufacturing plants. So that shows that tariffs did matter, but because 80% of UK GDP is services, we capture the effect was, I guess, less pronounced until you disaggregated the data by occupational code. So let me not repeat that.
I'm sorry, can we just wrap it up because time is up?
Sure. Yes. So let me skip the part let me just say that we do quite a few extensions. We have a separate analysis for financial services. Our results go through if we exclude London. We follow the literature on shift share controls. The results go through. We can use alternative measures of tariffs. We can use look at intermediate imports tariffs and NTBs, and this does not make a difference. So finally, let me wrap it up and say, well, so I've tried to convince you that Brexit vote mattered and that it mattered for online job advertising by creating this threat of barriers to services trade. But I would like to think of this paper as having broader implications than just implications related to Brexit. And this paper shows that anticipated barriers that have not been realized yet, already matter for real outcomes. That policy shocks matter for the economy in terms of things that are not visible, things that could have happened and should have happened but have not happened. Second, I would like to mention that, when you look at globalization, we have reaped the low-hanging fruit. We have lowered the barriers on trading goods. Services are the next frontier. And there is scope for further liberalization. You see that barriers to services matters, but actually at the moment, we have very limited appetite. If you look globally at what's happening, there is limited appetite for further liberalization. And just sort of to throw at you a speculation is, I wonder whether the change we have observed as a result of COVID, namely ability to work from home, will mean that we will be able to substitute remote work. We will be able, instead of having migrants coming into our country, of liberalizing services, we will be able to import services of people sitting in other countries simply because we can connect with them remotely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it is like a full paper and we learned a lot. There are lots of analysis in the paper. I personally have some questions, but I'd like to give the floor to the attendees. And so our first question is coming from Seyit Giresun. He's a colleague from our university. So the floor is yours, Seyit.
Thank you very much. And thank you. It was a very interesting paper and great presentation. I would like to ask a few questions. First of all, for your exposure variable, I understand that you do not observe export at those regions level. So you use these employment shares. I understand this, but yes, they are mostly be like correlated, but still the export and the employment dynamics could differ. I mean, I don't know the case in England, but maybe the regions that are close to coasts are, let's say, more exporting, but they have less worker share on these sectors. So this is my first question. The second one, did you control for sector time fixed effects, because the sectoral dynamics may be in charge in your estimation results? The third one is, did you try to use, it's interesting, the migration variable, number of EU migrants as a dependent variable, not to control it on the right-hand side variable to see the effects, but you may want to use it as a dependent variable. Finally, on the event study graph, I saw that you just omitted 2 quarters. The pre-period is shorter, but you still, instead of omitting only 1 quarter, excluding only 1 quarter, you included 2 quarters. Why? What is the reason behind this? And why do we see effect on the good jobs? Maybe I missed this part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is a very nice, comprehensive list of questions. So I hope I remember them all. So on measuring services exports at the regional level, we don't have it for all services, but such information exists for financial services. And we actually have a separate analysis in the paper, taking it into account. So it's not quite, at the travel to work area, but it's still quite disaggregated, and the results are equally strong. On controlling for services year fixed effect, we can't do it because remember our unit of analysis is locality. So we take the perspective of local labor market. And the sort of, you may ask, why aren't we classifying jobs by sector? And the answer is that basically burning glass technologies is unable to classify about half of the jobs by sector. Because, you know, many firms will say, I need a secretary, and it's very difficult to tell, you know, is it a manufacturing firm or is it a services firm? Just simply very hard to make a connection between sector and job posting, while the location is always specified because you need to tell people where you want them to work. On why these skilled jobs? Well, simply because services are about exporting people's brains, right? It's about exporting. So the services we consider are about exporting professional services of professionals, right? We focus on professional services, not on, let's say, restaurants. So it is quite intuitive that, you know, if financial sector or accounting sector or legal sector expects barriers to exports, then they are hiring fewer bankers, accountants, or lawyers. And these, by definition, jobs in professional services go mostly to professionals. I don't know if I have missed a question, but
maybe why you excluded 2 quarters in your event study?
Oh, by 2 quarters. Actually, it doesn't make a difference. I believe we, one of the papers dealing with event studies, I can't actually remember the reference now, was recommending using 2 periods as you know, omitted baseline rather than 1. But actually, in practice, it makes no difference. On using migrants as a dependent variable, it's a worthwhile exercise, but you know, I am a strong believer in one question, 1 paper. So that's something for future work.
Okay, thank you.
So any other questions from the floor? Actually, while the others are trying to wrap it up, let me ask a question. Actually, I wonder, you know, your analysis completes at the end of 2019. So I wonder, how did you observe the COVID period, and like, how do you see the extension of your analysis for this period?
So precisely because COVID period created such a disruption, we stopped at the end of 2019 because we don't want our results to be contaminated.
Sure.
Because also remember that services industries or professional services industries, just to be precise, may do better than some other industries, you know, as hospitality sector, for instance, right? So we don't want to extend the analysis precisely for that reason. And also, as you may recall, the UK was affected very severely by the first wave of COVID.
Any questions?
Okay, maybe I can ask a question. This is actually more like, it's not directly related to what you are doing in the paper, because this is such a well-written paper and you have covered pretty much whatever is out there in this universe, so in terms of robustness and everything. So I learned a lot. I loved it. Thank you very much. But my question is about the broader implications of your results, because you're saying something important. The UK was really heavily connected with the European Union. That was a very deep agreement. But then it was in a way, there's the reversal of that trade agreement. So I want to take this to the deep trade agreements that we are discussing today, which is trying to integrate services and investments into the regular trade agreements. So if you expose a lot of your, it's good that you're integrated. There are a lot of gains from this. But once you reverse this, then do you think the losses will be equivalently large, or it's less than that? I mean, in terms of resilience, are you making yourself more open to these shocks once they are reversed? So how careful should we be in terms of these deep trading agreements, particularly in the larger sectors of our economies? What's your take on this?
So first, I would think of our results as showing services barriers matter, right? Which means that deep agreements can bring gains.
Yes.
And now I would hope that as you are signing a deep trade agreement, you are not thinking about getting out in the future. Or at least if you are thinking that then you would be somehow informing the stakeholders about that. But a different way of answering your question is, are the results symmetric, right? So in a sense, is integration leading to the same gain in jobs as disintegration is leading in losses? And here, I'm afraid I can't really comment because I haven't analyzed a recent episode of integration with the same variable, right?
Yes.
So that's point number one. And point number two is that actually the literature looking at services integration is very limited. In international trade, we seem to be very biased towards looking at trade in goods simply because there's tons of data on both barriers, tariffs, right, and on trade flows. Why it's much harder to capture trade in services and to capture these barriers. So I think perhaps, I don't want to say these effects are symmetric. That's a question that I hope somebody will address in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's services is it's a very tough domain. We've been working on services as well. And there's this, the empirical investigations in services trade conference that we are organizing as well. And then it's the same thing, data is limited. And then we're talking about all these deep trade agreements, and we don't know much about how much we truly gained from these and what will be the prospective losses, because your paper actually, it just told me that it's large. It's not something that you cannot, just, ignore, that you can ignore. So one just wants to be pretty careful in, when designing these agreements. Of course, nobody gets into these by thinking that we're going to get out, but thinking the current political climate of the globe, these things just passes your mind.
I mean, one way to analyze the impact of deep trade agreements is, what some people do is they go in detail through text of the agreement, and then they somehow try to capture the content of the text. So that's one way of doing this. I mean, there's also a small literature trying to look at national commitments to GATS, right? General Agreement on Trade in Services, but those seem to have been sort of less binding. I guess perhaps what one could do more is look at cases of unilateral liberalizations, or a country joining the WTO and opening some services industries. But it's very hard to measure the outcome variable, simply because the data on services exports are just so hard to come by.
Exactly.
And it was also very surprising to see the effects on the financial services, because it's the most open sector, and there are international criteria for it to be open, like the Basel criteria. So and the SDRI on financial services is actually much lower compared to the others, but still it's one of the sectors that were affected significantly. So it was really surprising.
Actually, it's not surprising. And, and most of the debate in the UK about the post-Brexit future was about what would happen to the services industry. Because in the single market, right, any financial institution can operate in any member country. Now, once you leave so if you are a member of the single market, you have so-called passporting rights, right? These are these passporting rights. You can be active in any country. Once you leave, you need to rely on the equivalence, right? And this equivalence is something that can be revoked very quickly, and that, by design, if you plan regulatory divergence, you will get, it will not be possible to have equivalence, right? If you have a serious or meaningful regulatory divergence. Now, what's also interesting is if you look at the agreement that was signed right before Brexit, the actual Brexit agreement, I think there were 16 mentions of services and 240 mentions of the fish sector. So it was very much an agreement that ignored services industries, leaving this very difficult issue to the future to be resolved. So actually, if you read the sort of commentary about Brexit, the surprise in a way is that the financial sector suffered relatively little to what had been expected.
Actually, we learned a lot from your paper, and thank you very much again for accepting our invitation and for your talk and for the great paper.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Beata.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.